Hi, so my name is Alexandre Banks. This is just a quick 2026 follow-up to the 2019 and 2020 discourse of mine entitled My Theories of the Universe. Now, in that discourse, I wasn't aware of a lot of the current scientific consensus regarding topics like quantum physics, astrophysics, and even metaphysics, which, while not inherently a rigid scientific doctrine, was something that I was really exploring throughout a lot of that discourse. Now, I do think that this improved substantially in the second part of the discourse. However, there are some things that I would still like to clear up. So, the first topic that I'm going to unpack right now is the reason why I insisted on a multitude of universes, particularly in Part 2. Now, it's interesting because the logic actually kind of works backwards in a lot of ways, since in Part 2 I explained that if there are all of these universal diversions, as I believe I called them at some point, which the technical term I've understood in the many worlds interpretation, which is essentially what I was espousing, is decoherence. But I believed that due to all of these diversions, every single time that would happen, a new universe would be created. And since the universe began as a finite quantity, within a finite amount of space, and I believe it still is, and also assuming that space and time are discrete, which is a major topic I was touching on, and I believe I may have referred to it at some point as granularity, but the discreteness is the factor, which is a much more explicit way of spelling it out with a current understanding within the existing discourse, of which I was not entirely aware at the time. And because of that, assuming that space-time is discrete, saying, discreteness across all four dimensions, and that there has been a limited amount of time since the inception of the universe, and that the universe the expansion of the universe follows the known laws of physics, in that something cannot expand to an infinite value within a finite amount of time. Originally, I tried to clear this up by saying that the expansion was logarithmic, and what I really meant was exponential. But what would have been more accurate would be to have called it asymptotic, because that would be a means of essentially reconciling what would have to be infinite growth within a finite time frame. Although this is something that I didn't entirely believe at the time. It was kind of just a conceptual leap that I needed to use to make this infinite space theory possible. Now, in Part 2, I'm definitely still using this terminology of logarithm, or what's really exponential growth, but in a far more realistic way, because I'm not using it to explain asymptotic growth, which is an entirely different concept altogether. Now, what I will say is that assuming these three things are true, one, that space-time is discrete, two, that that the universe has only existed for a finite amount of time, or let's just say that the first universe has only existed for a finite amount of time, and three, that the growth and expansion of the universe follows the known laws of physics, then there are necessarily a finite, though extremely vast, number of universes. Now, there is just a little quick point I would like to clear up right now. There's something very interesting that in the first, in Part 1 of my theories of the universe, I am describing how travel between universes could look. Now, I don't know if this is possible right now, because from my current understanding, it appears to be that traveling at the speed of light would make it essentially impossible to travel between universes, and that you would have to break that speed to essentially open up a rift that would allow you to traverse between different universes. However, some theorists also believe that quantum mechanics might immediately destroy a wormhole, which would allow for such travel as soon as it's created. So I don't know about the potential for that. Also, the necessity of including exotic matter or matter with a negative energy density is something that I don't fully understand at the moment, but apparently would be necessary. And currently there doesn't seem to be a very clear consensus on whether or not it's possible to attain that much exotic matter necessary for inter or transuniversal travel. Now, I will say that what's interesting is I was focusing in part one mostly on travel between universes, but in part two I also expanded this theory to time travel. So in part two, I'm essentially saying things like, if the universe exists in that, there are all these diversions, or essentially decoherents, that are happening at the same time, and at an individual Planck time, or the II as I called it, there is a shift that is happening every single Planck time, in that some particles are decaying, some particles might be like doing nothing, and that essentially when you break down the amount of time that it takes for any particle to decay, or interact with another particle, or move, or anything like that, or simply exist, all of those things can fundamentally be broken down into Planck times, and every single one of them is just a multiple of Planck times, rather than some random, irrational decimal. And that they do have an ultimate limit to how small you can get. So if you break it down to that level, there are basically a certain number of universes that branch off from each universe every single Planck time. Because within a given universe, you have the combination of all of the different, or I don't know if permutation is the right word for this, but essentially, yeah, like a combination of all of the different changes which could happen at any time. Given all of the different subatomic particles, you have a certain number of pathways for how they can react given their situation at any Planck time. And so you have a certain number of possibilities for every single subatomic particle. You multiply this by essentially every single subatomic particle that's in the universe at that time, and it's going to be a different number for each one. Some particles, maybe all they can do is just decay into one thing, or remain as they are at a certain time. And this also has to do with probability rather than possibility, which makes it even more complicated. But you essentially multiply all of those amounts together, and you get the number of new universes that branch off from that one universe. However, you also have to remember that there are, at this time, a bunch of other universes existing that have been created in the same exact way, which basically creates a giant tree. So one thing that I expressed in the second part of my theories of the universe is that I was talking about time travel, and I essentially said time travel is almost like horizontal travel, traveling between different universes, in that saying, if you take an extremely unlikely probability, which is still possible, the fact that it's still possible means that there's still a universe out there, because it does follow the laws of physics, even if it's not entirely probable, in which that does exist. So you want to go 5 seconds back into the past, you would have to access a universe which was fundamentally the same as ours 5 seconds ago, but at every single Planck time, for some reason, every single particle basically stayed in its exact position. Now, 5 seconds might be so extreme that we're running up against a conceptual wall, in that it's not probable for that to happen. Eventually, some particles would have to decay. Maybe there's some particles running up against one another, and they're going to react in a certain way. That means that they can't just sit there and wait for 5 seconds, because it's not even physically possible at that point. However, if you were able to use this basically tree, what you could do is, it's interesting because the theory that I had is you can use horizontal travel to travel vertically. And what I mean by that is travel between universes in order to go back in time, because another universe will essentially, in my theory, just be like our universe, but a few seconds ago. Now, I think this might be very limited. Maybe you can go like a few nanoseconds or something like that. However, just traveling directly between universes, that may be impossible. But what may be possible in a very interesting way is saying that if such travel is possible, it would actually be the other way around. You would be traveling in a vertical way in order to travel horizontally, by which I mean you would be traveling back in time in order to wind up in another universe. So think about it as if you're on a certain branch of the tree and you're traveling up the branch all the way back into an even older, earlier branch or diversion, and then eventually once you get a certain point back in time, then you start going forward again, but take a different path and you wind up in a different universe. And in this way, you would essentially be able to, time travel and travel between universes would fundamentally be the same thing, because there are just an extremely vast number of realities out there, all of which are all possible realities which could exist at some point. And in order to get to any, essentially you basically just have to maneuver along the branches of this tree in a single two-motion pathway, which is a singular motion which takes you back to the exact time you would need to go back to reach the common denominator branch, which occurred before the diversions or decoherence. And then the second stroke or the second motion, you would essentially be traveling forward along another branch, which is different from your own, in order to get to that other universe, or you might consider it in the past. So essentially time travel would be necessary, and we're just talking about traveling into the past here. It would be necessary for that to happen. Now, it's interesting to see if there was a compressed path, maybe for some universes, and this is almost irrelevant at this point, but if, say, some particles decay quicker or some things happen sooner, and you basically just kind of take like a fast track, very compressed form of this universe and say, everything that's happened in the last day or so, I want to happen twice as fast. Now, there's a certain limit of probability to this. The Earth, for example, is only going to rotate on its axis at a certain speed. It's only going to orbit the sun at a certain speed, and things like that. But you could try at a very, minimal increment to say, I want things to speed up at this rate, which could result in, say, this is kind of a crazy hypothetical, but like a conversation happening sooner, or an interaction, some natural process, like a chemical process in the world occurring sooner than it does, which would effectively at least give you some semblance of transporting yourself into the future, which is an interesting way of conceiving of it. So one thing that I wanted to go back to was that in the first part of my theories of the universe, my theories were informed by sources which are very difficult for me to ascertain at this point. Now, to my own personal philosophy and the way that I understand the world, especially when it comes to theory, and particularly my own theory, is taking inventory and taking really account of all of the different sources and influences that inspired me at any given moment. And this is why when I'm looking at past philosophies or different belief systems, I am looking at what was the ideological predecessor or progenitor to that theory. And so that enables me to look at how the theory transformed in its roots and its origins, and what essentially gives it its identity. So when I recorded my theories of the universe, I claimed at some point that it may have began at summer 2018, because I have a distinct memory that before I created it, it was during that time. It was in the summer of 2018. However, I don't have any solid evidence for this, and the latest possible time it could have occurred would have been summer 2019, due to numerous factors. But the video which I created for my Theories of the Universe Part 1, I created it 2019. So at that point, I had essentially been attending Fermilab lectures for 2 years and learning about somewhat advanced topics within astrophysics and quantum physics without having a basic grasp or understanding of classical mechanics, let alone basic quantum physics. And so that resulted in a number of interesting conundrums, I suppose. And one of them was that I did not understand why a universe would be finite or infinite. And what's interesting is that while physics does seek to answer a lot of questions like this, there's a certain point where it's no longer the domain of physics and now the domain of metaphysics, which from my most recent understanding is undergoing a revival right now. Because as opposed to the critics of the last few centuries who've spoken out against metaphysical speculation, as well as in millennia-old traditions like within Buddhism, where such metaphysical speculation is even deemed as pointless and maybe even harmful for spiritual growth in some interpretations of emptiness belief, that essentially kind of trying to seek and trying to search for a metaphysical truth is tantamount to clinging to some semblance or understanding of reality, which is just a concept which functions the same way as a tangible object anyone else, for which anyone else could have desire. And so, while I understand the value of that, at this point, the metaphysical speculation has now greatly reemerged as a means of supplanting scientific ignorance in the field, which is to say, certain understanding or a lack of understanding when it comes to topics which are currently being researched but do not exactly fall within the realm of even theoretical science and physics, which is seeking to determine the true nature of the universe and the way in which it works. Now, it's very interesting to me when I think about superstring theory, in that the idea of 11 dimensions, when essentially you have these manifold dimensions which are curled up in this very small kind of almost like infinitesimal scale that would explain, apparently elegantly. I would love to learn about the math behind that and understand how it works, and I do seek to do that someday. But right now, apparently, it's been mathematically proven that the only way to eradicate these issues with string theory essentially functioning and working logically would be for there to exist 11 separate dimensions, and that around 7 of these are only accessible at a very, very small level, maybe at a subatomic level, although there's no empirical data to suggest that this exists. But the reason why is because we do not currently have the technology that could generate such data. So it's kind of just up in the air right now. But at the time, I was thinking about the universe, and I had this understanding that the Big Bang was, as many people understand it, a point at which the universe itself was almost infinitesimally small, and then it expanded and it kind of just exploded and at a very fast rate, and actually at what would truly be a logarithmic rate, not in the way that I explained it, in that it was started expanding very, very quickly at the onset and then eventually slowed and cooled, which is the way that it seems to be described, and now is apparently expanding again, so that it would almost create a bell shape if you were to look at time as a vertical axis with higher values signifying an earlier time in the universe. However, this is not the way that the Big Bang Theory functions at all, and is actually a very common misconception. In reality, the Big Bang Theory appears to be an understanding of the way that the matter within the universe existed, in that all of the distances we know today were very compact, and that the idea of relativity, which is terrifying to think about if you're trying to understand the universe as a finite entity at all, is that, and this is where the idea of a finite universe really runs into some problems, is that everything seems to be moving away from everything else. If you stand at any point, the universe appears to be moving away from you. And if, we were able to send like a satellite out very, very far into the far reaches of the solar system, which I believe they have, then it would also appear to that satellite, that everything was moving away from it. And so I think one theory that may be able to explain this is that essentially the universe is just so giant that no matter where you go, you would have to zoom out really, really, really far in order to be able to see that there is a certain correlation that everything is expanding from a certain center. But even then, if you were to think about the universe expanding spherically from a certain center and position yourself and zoom in to an incredible distance within that sphere, it would almost appear that everything is moving away in a line from a same one. Everything is moving away in a lockstep, almost like a rectangular prism, just expanding away in one direction, because you would be so zoomed in that you wouldn't be able to see the curvature of the sphere, and everything would just look like it is moving away from you and kind of shrinking and receding to a certain point in the distance, which would basically mean that you are being, there is an expulsion which is pushing you out towards the periphery of the sphere. And so that is not our current understanding, and it looks like everything is moving away from us, which, given the idea of a finite universe, the only theory that I can think of would mean is that we're very close to the center of the universe, which I think might signify a lot of hubris and might risk being a very egoistic theory on the part of the human species. However, there is also the signification of life, which I did describe at some point in my Theories of the Universe Part 2, and I talked about how consciousness is critical and even imbued, that every cell in a body essentially takes on consciousness. So this actually almost solved a problem. It sidestepped a problem which arose later. So it's interesting because if you think about the progression from my Theories of the Universe Part 1 to Part 2 to what I called the Truths of the Universe, which is to say from 2019 to 2020 to 2023, the first part which I wrote in 2023, it actually appears to go in a reverse order. The truth of the universe, I believe in this very Manichaean, dualistic, actually unity of being influenced conception of the universe, in which there are two fundamental substances. There is matter and there is consciousness. Consciousness as a perception is God. And I'm saying this because the consciousness of every single conscious being, possibly every single living being, and potentially every single being as it exists, is essentially trapped within this elaborate architecture of a very kind of sticky web of matter. And that when you achieve liberation from this matter, the consciousness is able to kind of fly out of it and rejoin the rest of the consciousness, which essentially reconstitutes God, which means that God isn't one thing, but is maybe there's a little bit of it outside of the matter structure, which is what I call the non-God component, or NGC. But the majority of it right now is kind of trapped in these little globules, which are cordoned off from one another, and that they need to be able to break free from those kind of cells and reintegrate with one another to reconstitute God at the end of the universe. And I explained some divine goal for this, but at a pure modern metaphysical level, the reason behind this doesn't entirely matter as much. The idea is just that there are two fundamental substances. Now, the problem with this is if you think about fundamental forms as they arise, and you're thinking about consciousness, if you look at ontology, and specifically mereology, the idea of the ship of Theseus is a great way of putting this, and especially within Buddhist metaphysics, it breaks it down brilliantly to think about how if you have a chariot and you take away the wheels and you take away, the horse and the driver essentially, and the actual carriage itself, like the body of it, what's left? There is nothing left. Now, that might not be the best analogy for the modern day, but it does allow for an understanding that everything is essentially composed of human-conceived categories that we understand and we process through our brains, and that consciousness is the basis through which we understand reality, which is mirrored in Kant's, I believe, noumenon, and also in Yogacara philosophy. So with the division between the lens through which we understand reality, essentially the reality as we perceive it and the reality which actually exists, there are some issues that come about as a result of this mereology. So this kind of takes me to the next point, because if you're thinking about Platonic forms as they exist, it's very nice to think of things as conceptualized as, oh, I'm a certain being, this plant is a certain being, maybe even this rock over here, but it's very, very easy to break this down immediately with the understanding that while there are some things which can be composed of multiple parts, and what happens if you take those parts away? And there are different ways to avoid or, get around this and answer them in ways that say, oh, well, there are different determined consciousnesses, and it's more complicated than just that, and it breaks down into a little bit more sophisticated model. But in reality, one of the best ways to answer this is via not the dualist model to which I had previously subscribed, but a more monist lens that is in line with panpsychism, actually. And it appears that this is exactly what I was doing with my Theories of the Universe, Part 2. So, for example, I was struggling a lot with the connection, or lack thereof, when it came to how matter and consciousness can coexist in such an intimately intertwined way without, with consciousness existing as independent. And upon looking into a lot of explanations behind this, there are some people that believe that matter is conscious. This is a radical form of animism, actually. And it posits that, a lot of ancient cultures that existed and a lot of peoples which still exist around the world were and are onto something, which is that every single thing, not even just living things, but all matter in the universe has some consciousness. But there's still this problem of how am I one unified consciousness and I'm all of these different cells working together in this giant system, whereas if you get to like a rug or something, how would you break that down? Would it be its own thing only because it's physically separated from the environment? Well, the logic of the mereological discourse cutting the illusion, which I described earlier, would dictate that the surrounding world, there aren't any forms. There aren't things which everything exists based on everything else. Nothing exists inherently in and of itself. Everything arises in relation to everything else. And so because of that can take place temporally, which is an easy way to think of it. And that's actually great, because what it does is it resolves one of those issues like, oh, how could the whole universe arise from nothing? It's like, well, it has to rise from something. So, that could give you a conception, which is the biggest, broadest kind of scale of what I'm working with here, which is probably that, the universe is it bounces back and it exists on like a loop. And if you were to zoom out and look at the shape of the universe over time, it would almost look like kind of like an infinite loop just going on along a single line forever, which is to say that it kind of it explodes onto the open void, and then eventually it kind of starts to recombine and come back and constrict until nothing, and then it just it cinches up into a single point, and then it once it reaches that point, it explodes again, and then it kind of expands and contracts again and again, just ad infinitum. And because the energy is recombined, it's enough energy to retransfer into the rest of the universe. And so, in a sense, you basically have, it's a closed system. So you have an infinite energy pathway, in which case there's no energy leaving the system. So that means there's enough to be left over for it to create an infinite energy loop, which is not possible in physical systems within the universe. However, this comes into some conflict with the idea of a multiverse, because if you have different universes that exist, and they're all branching out, how is this branch going to work with the idea of the closed loop? Because one theory could be that they all exist within an omniverse, and the omniverse is what is opening up and closing, maybe in a very metaphysical way, which I think I actually explored in the second chapter of The Truths of the Universe. But that basically, in a very, very abstract way, all the universes have this kind of like, at the surface level, the universe has this branch, it kind of diverges, it, keeps going, it runs its course, and eventually it just dies at a certain point. And that happens to all the universes until you wind up with a tree in this branch, and it just kind of keeps going until all the particles have been exhausted in the longest possible universe which could exist. And so the problem with that is that eventually you wind up with, this end universe, and maybe say, okay, that one, the longest living universe, is the one that continues the loop, and that's the one that eventually ends up, closing. But then you could have multiple different universes closing at the same time, and it's very uncertain how multiple different universes would all end. And then would those loops no longer line up anymore? And then that would create implications for the omniverse, and that would get even more complicated because then we'd be out of sync with one another. Well, I think that if you have all of these universes going at the same time, they're going to do whatever they do, but then within the broader omniverse, the omniverse is what, in a weird metaphorical way, it's not that the universes all, I think this is the end result, but at the surface level, it's not that all the universes open up and then they exist for a while and then all agree to just close down at the same time. It's that the potential for all of the universes, calculated by the combination of all the different particles which could exist at any given time, is what is opening and closing and creating this kind of constant cycle of like kalpas, as they're sometimes called in the classical Indian theory of metaphysics, in Hinduism, and I believe also in Buddhism in some contexts. And that it's not the universes, but it's the omniverse, which represents the potentiality of all the different universes. And it's not a physical space, but it's kind of a potential which is opening and closing over time. And then that is the constant infinite energy loop, which allows for material reality to exist in the first place. So that closes up the theory pretty well, I would say. But still there's this issue of how that consciousness can exist. So a lot of these are just a lot of theories posit that it's essentially multiple different factors which are acting at the same time, like the idea of the 5 skandhas, the body, the consciousness, mental formations, feelings, and sensory perceptions, from what I understand. And that those all kind of come together and coalesce and interact with each other and are all function as aspects of something which creates the illusion from ignorance of a broader self. And there's also another interpretation of this which doesn't arise from Buddhism, which is that, but it reaches a very similar conclusion, that essentially the idea that we have this one unified or singular consciousness at all is driven by a variety of factors that as soon as you begin to try and understand what it is that is perceiving, it's very liberating, because it's the idea that if there's an individual self, if there is, a me or singular person that exists, someone that you can call yourself, then whatever happens to it is essentially a singular deterministic fate. It either exists, carries on, and it can't dissipate. It's just kind of locked into this category. And if you think about someone else, if there's an other consciousness, there's nothing that separates another person from like a rock to you, in your consciousness, because they are both just physical things which exist out there in the world. And from the perspective of your consciousness, you don't all of a sudden switch in your mind and then you're like in their body somehow, and then their consciousness is yours. That's the only way that the bridge could be gapped in this very individualistic way of looking at the the structure of consciousness, from perception. And this is what gives rise to the solipsism, which governed so much of the theory and was really the kind of the razor edge, which, against which I would sharpen a lot of the theories, if they can be reconciled with that. But the nice thing about the theories that argue against the individual ownership or possession of consciousness when it comes to any physical form, and that, these forms can't exist and can very easily be broken down by logic, is that the positive benefit that you get from that is that there is nothing individual about that consciousness and exist. And this is why I espoused in, I believe, On Consciousness on the Universe, that there are almost these point consciousnesses and kind of waves that wash over them. And the waves are of the physical characteristics that arise, which can also be chalked up to neurology, like things in the brain, as well as processes of the body itself. And so when you put all of those together and it washes over a singular point of perception, then that's how that can happen. But otherwise, if we were saying that, it's a loose association of particles of matter that exist as consciousness, it's just some systems that are able to come together and function very coherently and work together very well, so as to give the illusion that they are completely isolated from everything else. And that may seem like a half explanation, but that's the main reasoning that I can think of that would explain it well enough right now. So I got to say that my theories of the universe actually explained this away very well, which is interesting because it came before the truths of the universe, which was struggling to reconcile this understanding. And Theories of the Universe Part 2, at which point I was already dealing with these solipsistic concerns, posits that perception itself, consciousness or unconsciousness in the universe, as I posit in that text, the one entity which we can know to be true, or which I can know to be true from within consciousness, is consciousness itself, although not provable to anyone else. And there's that kind of paradox there. The idea is that it is matter. Matter is conscious. And when people say, okay, what is a subatomic particle doing, decaying into one thing or another, that is essentially the most basic form of consciousness. Every single time that a subatomic particle decays, we treat it as a probability and essentially just a random chance that there is a slightly higher likelihood for it to decay into something than something else, or for it not to decay, or for it to have this reaction when it interacts with another particle. But in reality, what's happening there is the same exact way that consciousness works. It is affected by factors which surround it in its environment, and it functionally makes a decision in the same way that a very organized structured consciousness would. I think one way of understanding it is that basically there are all of these particles which exist and make conscious decisions and interactions in relation to one another, and it really strips consciousness down from this idea of a being to just the basic nature of the way that reality works, and that these not even point consciousnesses, but these particles, which are conscious in and of themselves, have only the ability to do like 2 or 3 things, and it's just a choice between those. It's a very simple, it's like a profoundly simple computer circuit. But as soon as they start to interact with one another, form atoms, those are more complex systems. When they interact and form larger systems, those create even larger entities which can be understood to be conscious in the same way. This is interesting because it also ties into Gaia theory, how if the Earth is conscious, if you think about it, it's basically a construction of many, many systems put together, and it functions. Well, this is why I say functionally, as opposed to inherently or something based on principle, but it functions as a consciousness. So if you're saying a human being, there are neurological concepts which came together originally in the form of life. Now, life is what's very interesting to me because it represents an extension of this which we have scientifically, or the human species has just kind of decided that is fundamentally different from the rest of this. Now, in order to look at that key difference, you have to go back to the very earliest form of life, which contains some element of DNA. Now, from what I understand, viruses contain RNA, but not DNA. I may be completely wrong here, but that is my general understanding right now. Now, the implication of this is that if you're dealing with the earliest forms of life that are not a virus, it is essentially just that chemical and, coheres into a being which exists essentially completely independently of its environment. Now, obviously, everybody is affected by their environment. That's not what I'm saying, in that its actions are completely independent, but what I'm saying is that its determinism or its determination and its free will are independent. So, for example, if you're looking at the Gaia theory, you have this extremely complex interconnected web of systems of the Earth. All of them are existing, but you can never really say that, the Earth is a conscious being, or that, the nitrogen cycle is a manifestation of a conscious being, or that, geothermal activity is, all of those things. They're all interlinked, and it all just depends on how you break it down. You could go down to the subatomic level, and it would give you the most granular view that, yes, look at all of these different quarks and all these different neutrinos and and the bosons and the ways that they are interacting with one another. That would give you the most determined, the most easily provable idea that, yes, all of these things are independently conscious, and then kind of just form these loose associations. But it's almost like they're not conscious that they are conscious in a weird way. It's like just a mass of very loosely based things that exist. However, with life, it's the first development within this kind of consciousness branching system that can completely isolate and basically create an illusion that it is independent of its environment. So if you were to say have some of the very first life forms, like a single-celled organism or something like that, an extremely primitive, simplest form of a cell which could possibly exist, obviously it's many, many subatomic particles working together to form atoms, to form molecules, which exist in these complex structures, which can kind of build up to larger structures that create the cell. And what it does is it functions so coherently that it, when it's just one cell, it is almost like, how would this work much differently than a chemical procedure which happens and creates little globules of a certain chemical. But what happens is that as that form of life gets larger, its insular nature, and that it's kind of isolated, or gives off the idea to itself that it's isolated from the rest of the universe, becomes more apparent. So then by the time you work up to animals, it's very easy to see how it appears that they are just these set conscious boundaries, and they're this is when they think about the open individualism, which I think is connected with the panpsychism that I was espousing earlier, that open individualism would basically dictate that there are these kind of peaks. And if you look at the peaks above the water, it looks like they're these separate mountains. But if you go underneath the water, you realize that they're actually all connected, part of the same mountain. They're fundamentally the same substance. So this is the early realization. But if you think about it a little bit differently, you would understand, okay, why does life do this, but other physical processes in the universe don't do this? Well, I think that it could be because life as it exists is capable of essentially kind of producing this illusion to itself that isolates its existence from the rest of the universe, and that it's capable of creating a perception and awareness within itself that is able to function independently enough that its very first instinct is that it is a fundamental substance, and that everything outside of it is different and is not linked to its conscious determination. So that is why once you build up to multi-celled organisms like protists and things like that, and eventually plants, animals, fungi, then it becomes very easy to see how it can just be understood as this is one being where all the systems kind of create this protective shield where it's isolated from it. It gives a very individualistic view that everything outside, just at a purely metaphysical level, everything outside of the consciousness is not connected to it. Whereas if you're looking at like Earth systems, you can kind of see some loose associations, but every single one of these subatomic particles is still acting in its own conscious determination. And so because of that, you can see life not as just, or the consciousness that develops from the matter within life, not as a fundamental difference, creating a new type of dualism between it and the consciousness inherent in the matter of the rest of the universe, consciousness as a property of matter, which some panpsychists espouse. Very, very fascinating theory. But as simply another one of the many organizations which can happen with matter, in which case with consciousness, with living beings, it's essentially a similar organization, but it functions to give itself a feeling of isolation and separation from the rest of the universe at the belief that, it has free will and can decide things for itself, basically clumping up the individual decisions of subatomic particles within it to the determinations of one mind, essentially making a mind that's capable of extremely complicated choices and makes extremely complicated choices all the time, rather than just a loose association of individual subatomic particles which act sometimes in accordance with one another and make very simple decisions all the time. And so, and it's interesting because then in this sense, the liberatory narrative of Buddhism would make 100% sense according to this doctrine, because it would basically be that there is nothing inherently any different about the consciousness inherent in life than there is to the consciousness which is a principle of existing matter, which is found in subatomic particles and exist and participate in broader systems. The only difference is that the consciousness, or the matter, combines in such ways to essentially unify its consciousness, or give it the illusion that it's unified into one being or one form, when in reality it's just a very integrated way of these things appearing. So I don't know if there's a way to break down this boundary and expose it as a spectrum. Like some people say that, hallucinogenic substances might be one way to do that. And I don't know, because a lot of other reports will say, that's just altering your sensory perception rather than changing the nature of consciousness itself. But it's certainly interesting to think about. But yeah, this was actually posited in my Theories of the Universe Part 2. I mean, not everything that I just said, but the theory that all of these individual beings, all of the subatomic particles, are conscious, and that basically there's no need to divide matter into consciousness because they are, because consciousness is a principle of matter. Just like if you look at any other subatomic principle, like spin or, charge or something like that, the ability to make decisions for itself, which takes away the uncertainty of there being a random, probability and just determination of any of the different particles, which essentially means that the universal splitting of the constant branching of the universe is caused by countless decisions of conscious beings at the subatomic level happening at every Planck time. So in my Theories of the Universe Part 2, though, there is this question of what happens if there are all these universes, or basically these different potential pathways for what can happen. Now, I might as well address one of the major concerns which happens here, which is saying, why do they need to be universal diversions in the first place? And this actually comes from sometimes what happens at the quantum level is not the most probable option. And why would that be? And essentially saying if the universe is not a predetermined game created by a conscious being in which everything will exist and go in accordance to an exact certain way down to the subatomic level, then why the specificities of why certain particles react in one way than another. And it would say essentially it's the result of all these consciousnesses, but the very idea that each consciousness can essentially choose its own pathway, and that this exceedingly random cause, there is no reason for that. From the beginning, from the inception of the universe, if we are understanding it as a and not just the Big Bang, when we say all the matter and the distances were compressed themselves and that everything all around the universe was just almost infinitesimally dense, but the idea that the physical space of the universe at a time when physics is, or right now, is not exactly answering the question of the size itself and the structure and organization of the universe, as opposed to just, the density of distances. There is no reason for there to be a bunch of random conscious particle decisions occurring at any given time, and for it to go one way and not another if the universe expanded, even if the universe expanded from a singular motion, let's say, even in the very mechanistic way that I described in my Theories of the Universe Part 2, that, like, say, one particle moves to the right, and then that is the decision that sets off the rest of the universe. Even that simple decision could not give rise to all of the complicated random things which are going on in the universe right now. And, but there is a major contradiction to this argument, which is look at universal constants like pi or e or phi. Like, those are totally random numbers that just exist in relation to, I believe, the cardinal numbers, or just integers, and they do represent basic constants of the universe, but have no apparent relation to those integers that makes any logical sense. So this could be solved with the metaphysical premise of absurdism, which also destroys the speculative analysis which I was previously looking to use. But putting that aside, the only major answer I could think of to this is that we are in one of the many possible universes which exist. And that actually, if you think about a universe as existing independently as its own free thing, then our universe is changing to different universes at every single Planck time, because that means it's branching apart, which means that if I were to think about 5 seconds ago, our universe would be the same as countless other ones before all of those different branches happened. And that would mean that it's not the same. It was part of an earlier universe that just split over the course of those 5 seconds into a ridiculous number of different branches. And, but if we're treating our pathway of the universe as just kind of one constant thing, just for convenience, the only possible situation that I can imagine that would make sense is that it is in its specific way, just because there are all these other universes that exist almost to kind of balance out the probability or the paths not taken by our universe. And I am going to say that when I'm thinking about this idea of multiple universes existing, that is actually, and the implications of that's actually resolved to a great degree in my Theories of the Universe Part 1. So hopefully by now you'll see the progression, that issues that arose in the truth of the universe from 2023 were almost sidestepped and solved by my Theories of the Universe Part 2 in 2020, and issues that arose in Part 2 from 2020 were basically resolved in my Theories of the Universe Part 1 from 2019. So it's almost an interesting kind of reverse progression there. Now, if there's anything that remains to talk about, it is the influences which I had at the creation of my Theories of the Universe Part 1. So besides all the technical inaccuracies which were inherent to that discourse, and a lot of the logical inconsistencies that occurred throughout, and just with mathematical computation and understanding of math itself, I do think that it's worth it just as a rundown of the influences which caused me to create that. So like I said, I'd been attending Fermi Lab lectures for roughly 2 years at that point, and I was very fascinated with the way that the universe worked, with the ideas of universal expansion and how matter works at the quantum level. And I was also very fascinated by the infinite math created by, I believe his name is Georg Cantor, who was talking about but also the idea of Hilbert's infinite hotel paradox. And just kind of this concept that there are multiple different levels of infinity and that this can be used to explain universes. And the frustrating understanding of the reason why I had, the universe being infinite and there being infinite universes, which are 2 points which I completely eschewed and disavowed in the following discourses and following texts which I wrote, is mainly just due to one conception that I had at the time, which has ultimately rung true for this whole time, which is to say that if everything is expanding in the universe out from every single point in what looks like a direction of a way out, and we have the humility to assume that it's not just because we happen to be extremely close to the center of the universe or at the center of the universe, then it is because the universe is infinite and essentially just expanding outwardly in every direction. And now another major misconception I had with part one was the misconception of the way that people say a saddle or hyperboloidal shape to the universe versus a spherical shape to the universe versus a flat one. Now, what I thought they meant was that the actual shape of the universe, if you were to look at it from the outside, it would be a sphere, or it would be a flat plane, or it would be kind of like a saddle shape. Now, obviously, I dismissed the idea of a flat plane, but it does have some interesting implications when you think about it in terms of finite versus infinite, because with a flat plane and the universe is infinite, that would mean that essentially if you zoom out and it's just like, a rectangle or something, then the 2 dimensions would be infinite. 2 dimensions you could travel in forever, because it would be infinite. But because it's flat, it would only have 2 dimensions, which would mean that one dimension, the third one, which is going up and down, would be flat, which would mean that it would have 0 value. And in the context of infinity, if the other sides are infinite and like the 0 value, as I've discussed many times, would have a finite value, which would mean that we are not in flat space. So there is potential for 3 dimensions, but it would mean that if you keep going up for a certain amount and you keep going down, you're going to reach limits. But if you go around to the sides, there will be no limits, which means that the universe is infinite in 2 dimensions, but not in 1, which I think I've just understood as a weird arbitrariness. And kind of a similar concept with the saddle theory. While I did give it its credit, I did not understand what it was based on. Now, it turns out for all 3 of these theories, my conception was completely wrong, and that it doesn't refer to the actual shape of the structure of the outside of the universe, but it refers to the way that space is expanding into other space. So the flat conception is that, and it has to do with the curvature of space, which is something I still don't quite understand, because people often use like a sphere or they say like almost like a Pringle-shaped kind of hyperboloid, something like that, or a flat surface to explain this. So obviously, if you have spherical curvature, then that means you're going to add up, say you're on the globe and you go from the North Pole to the equator and then rotate 90 degrees to go to another point on the equator and then go back up to the North Pole. Then essentially what you're going to create is a triangle, because it's fully closed, has straight lines, has 3 angles, and yet the angles themselves add up to way more than 180. They add up to like 270 or something. And I think this is about as extreme as it can get in that direction, whereas a hyperboloid would be the exact opposite. So they say that, space just works the same way, which would imply that all of these 3 dimensions are essentially just kind of projected onto a fourth, which we do not understand. It's curving into four-dimensional space, that we are almost on the surface of a four-dimensional sphere or something, that a four-dimensional being would be able to look at and say, well, it's simple, you think you're going in a straight line, but you're actually going in like a weird curve. But apparently no, it's intrinsic curvature, which just means that it's curving into itself, and doesn't require a fourth dimension for that to happen, which is a concept that I still can't wrap my brain around right now. But nonetheless, it looks like there actually may be the greatest proof for what they call a flat universe, which essentially means that everything exists as it does in the Euclidean geometry in 2 dimensions that just happens to be in 3 dimensions, which is a very satisfying conclusion, because it means you don't have to deal with the disorganization of space when it comes to going to very long distances, and the space light would not be curved, plus the empirical evidence that they have to suggest that this may be very well possible, or at least from what I remember, more possible than a hyperboloidal shape to the universe. But this still doesn't clear up the idea of the universal expansion. And this is the one kind of smoking gun which would legitimize my theories from part 1 and essentially put down everything which I argued afterwards about the idea of a finite universe and there being multiple different finite universes in an extreme number, but still under infinity. And it would do that because if you had a finite universe that was expanding from a certain point, it wouldn't make any sense with the current scientific understanding, which is one of the few things they've gleaned about this, which kind of flies in the face of that, which is to say that it's seeming to expand outwards from every single point, that everything is expanding away from everything else. So while this may refer to the physics of the universe as it exists, it creates problems for understanding whether it's infinite or finite. So as of right now, I don't know what the answer to that would be, but to really cover the theories that I had going into it in 2019, when I was originally creating my theories of the universe and committing that to a recording, some of the concepts I was understanding besides like George Cantor and infinite mathematics were a lot of mathematics channels on YouTube, actually. So like 3 Blue 1 Brown was a major source of inspiration for me, as well as, like I said, what was taught over the course of roughly 2 years or so at Fermilab lectures, and those were both major sources of inspiration for me. So for some reason I wound up with the idea that the universe is infinite, which I would say could be chalked up to the empirical data that scientists currently have regarding universal expansion and the way it works. And then the second idea that there are an infinite number of universes, which I think that if the expansion of the universe, assuming that the expansion of the universe follows a finite time frame, when people say 13.8 billion years, they're just talking about the observable universe. They're talking about what we can observe, which means that there could be a universe outside of that. It's just light hasn't, would take too long to reach what we can perceive of it, basically. And then if you look beyond that, maybe there wasn't that much going on in the universe, but it still existed, so there's still stuff out there that is expanding further away. It's just that we can't see it. And I think, or maybe it's light, I'm not exactly sure, it died out a long time ago. But that's just, and I've also heard someone say like a 40 billion years figure, and that could be a larger set of the universe, but ultimately what we don't have is how large it would be. So assuming that there can't be asymptotic growth, the universe can't just expand to infinity within a certain amount of time, in which case if it did, then this idea that everything is just kind of expanding away from everything else would make total sense, because there would be no center, because it would be infinite. But, or at least, I don't know if you can conceptualize an infinite space of having a center, maybe you can, but at least it would be possible that it would have no center, being infinite. And so that would solve some issues. But also, if it was infinite, which is assuming that it was created in an infinite amount of time, ago, even if space-time is discrete, which I just very briefly touched on, I believe, in part 1, it would still result in an infinite number of universes. So that's a logical conclusion from the first step. And if I'm saying that there are an infinite number of universes and the space-time itself is infinite, then there's no reason for them to exist at the same kind of physical plane, or as I've understood, it's referred to as a brane, B-R-A-N-E, the four-dimensional existence of the universe, like a field, of the universe. And so that they would essentially exist at, like I said, the same exact kind of space and time, but almost in different realities. And so that is how they would coexist with one another. So those are just some reflections. I'm also going to say that I commented to a friend that I had at the time in 2019 about my theory that essentially every single decision, because it's like what creates the determinacy of these decisions. How can we exist in a universe where there are just these random singular decisions which happen and the universe goes down that path? We don't experience it else. And it could be because what we are perceiving, us saying everybody in the universe, or essentially my consciousness and how my consciousness would perceive everyone else's consciousness to exist and how their consciousness would perceive mine. And the other consciousness of everyone else in the universe, that it is kind of just going down this pathway because of collective understanding, but there is no reason why none of the other pathways can't exist, and that it's maybe just it almost creates this kind of, again, cordoned off ideal that in a similar way, maybe not in the same exact identical, but as an analogy, they're kind of, in a sense, quote unquote, cordoned off from us in the same sense that the existence of other inherently conscious subatomic particles, or the fact that everything possesses consciousness, is cordoned off from a living conscious being to give it the illusion that it is a unified and singular form which exists, even though everything has that attribute. And that's just the principle and the nature of the way it interacts with the universe. But I was kind of expressing the idea that if there are all these different potential possibilities, there's no reason for reality to take every single one, and that if the consciousness is as simple and straightforward as just at a subatomic level choosing between a couple options of kind of which particle to decay into, then for all the particles, it would essentially be that each split or universal diversion, or really decoherence, creates a new universe. And so I was explaining this to my friend in 2019, and they said that they informed me of the many worlds interpretation, and that essentially this idea already exists, and I kind of just arrived there, simultaneity of thought, right? Just kind of arrived there based on my own logic and understanding of the universe. So yeah, ultimately, I don't know if that clears anything up about my theories of the universe, part 1 and 2, and how they exist within the broader understanding of my metaphysical work from 2018 through the current day, which is to say 2026. But yeah, those are generally my thoughts.